Shabbat Shalom. So if you're here on the second day of Rosh Hashanah this year, you may remember that I shared with our community an experience from my young adulthood. I was on a gap year, a post-high school gap year in Jerusalem during the Gulf War. And as I shared at that time, I was staying in a dorm. It was an all-girls school. We were mostly Americans. And when the war broke out, the dorm emptied. About 80 to 90% of the girls went home. Those of us who remained were issued gas masks and got to have that quintessential Israeli experience of rushing to the sealed room, sitting there with our gas masks on, listening for sounds out in the dark. And as we know, in the end, Israel suffered no direct casualties during that war. But at the time, we did not know we were safe. When my classmates made the very prudent decision to fly home, and when I and about 20 other girls made the decision to remain, we had every reason to believe the reports of weapons of mass destruction. That's why we were issued those gas masks. I was 18 years old at the time. My older daughter, Shira, is 19 years old right now. And I hadn't thought about that experience for years until I sat down to write that sermon. And thinking of my daughter off in college, I was shaking my head and wondering, how did my parents let me stay? So, so in preparing to write that sermon, I called them and asked, like, how did you let me stay? And their answers were remarkably vague. They really don't remember how they felt. Were they ambivalent? Was it hard? No memory. So here's what I remember of the conversations. All had, this was the days before email, certainly no cell phones. There was two telephones, one at the top of the stairs and one at the bottom stairs for 100 girls. So it was hard to communicate, but I do remember a few conversations. One was, I truly believed if I stayed in Jerusalem, I was safe, because Saddam Hussein would not want to target Jerusalem, right? And my parents told me, okay, if you stay, you can't leave the city during the war, which definitely helped bolster that feeling of security. But I'm not sure what we actually believed about I think it's true he probably didn't want to target Jerusalem, but what we actually believed about the accuracy of his targets, of his ability to target, I'm not really sure, because I do remember that as we got further into the war, there were rumors that when the air raid sirens went off, there were a lot of guys who would go up on the roofs to watch the Patriots explode the Scud missiles midair. It was like fireworks, right? So if they could see it, I don't know why we thought we were so safe. The other piece I remember, I'm out of order here, one sec. The other piece I remember is that, this part's also a little funny in a dark way. Before we'd finalized the decision, my father told me, there could be a lot of casualties in Israel. And I said, well, then I would want to volunteer to help to tend to the wounded. And he said, wartime nursing is very bloody. All the more so then I would want to help. And I'm sure I meant it, which is quite amusing, because 2 years earlier when I was 16, I literally fainted, blacked out and fell on the floor watching a friend donate blood. But yeah, I thought at age 18 I was past this and I was going to do wartime nursing. So the takeaway is that my parents certainly did not pressure me to stay in Israel through that war, but they also clearly did not pressure me to come home. They asked me questions, and somehow they trusted me to make my own decisions at the age of 18. Was I a fool? Were they? Take that into the story of this week's Torah portion, where, as Bill shared, we read about 12 scouts sent to spy out the land in preparation for the conquest. And 10 bring back a report that the land is bountiful, but it's inhabited by giants and we will never overcome them. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, come back emphasizing the goodness of the land and stressing that with God on our side, we can succeed. What struck me this year for the first time, I don't remember thinking this before, is that those 10 scouts were not wrong. The land was inhabited by giants. And in fact, the conquest was very difficult. 40 years later, the next generation spent the rest of their lives under Joshua's leadership trying to complete the conquest. Yes, their enemies fell before them one after another, but only because God was making these crazy miracles. Like in one case, God actually stops the sun from moving across the sky so the Israelites can win their battle. If it weren't for these supernatural miracles, it's very clear without this really heavy-handed divine intervention, and even with this heavy-handed divine intervention, they still didn't succeed in conquering the entire land. So the scouts were not wrong. And if we didn't know the end of the story, I would say that those 10 naysaying scouts were actually the adults in the room. And Joshua and Caleb seemed kind of like naive 18-year-olds. But we do know the end of the story. The 10 scouts doomed themselves and the entirety of their generation to die in the desert. And the text frames those 40 years of wandering as God's wrathful punishment, but it was also the natural consequence of their report. With an attitude that assumed failure, they couldn't possibly have taken the land. Of that entire generation, only Joshua and Caleb lived to enter the promised land. So this Torah portion works on multiple levels. On one level, it is a powerful metaphor. We have so much in our world, in our lives as individuals, in our country, that we want to make better, that feels totally overwhelming sometimes. And there is little we can accomplish if we allow these obstacles, as giant as they may be, to obscure our vision of possibilities. Through the centuries, though, this Torah portion has also operated not just as metaphor for our people, but really at face value. Our ancestors never stopped believing that the promised land would be ours again. And until the birth of Zionism, they also believed that the time to reclaim the land would not arrive until God indicated willingness to work miracles for us. I'm talking like sun stopping in the sky. I'm talking like walls of Jericho crumbling because of the shofar blast, those kinds of miracles. So the power of Zionism came in merging the face value with the metaphor. The promised land is still literally the land. For Jews in the diaspora, it never stopped being that. But the path to claiming it is no longer through supernatural miracles, but through our own human efforts. And that meant to claim our promise, we did not have to wait for God to appear. We just had to believe in ourselves. So I suspect that back in 1991, my parents understood this intuitively. If I believed in Israel, young as I was, if my faith and love for the place and the people was greater than my fear, then I would be able to do things that I could never have done otherwise. And I'm thinking today that our power to accomplish miracles does not end with conquest. If you take a tally of the specific, I'm not talking generic, like God is great, but the specific themes in our prayer book, which is a couple thousand years old, almost, you will find two themes dominate above all the others. One is God's promise to return us to the land, and that means the land, Israel. And the other is God's capacity to create peace. And peace always has the last word. We end the Amidah, the central prayer, 3 times a day, 4 times on Shabbat, with Sim Shalom, give us peace. We end the Kaddish, Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu. May the one who makes peace in heaven make peace upon us. We end the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom. May Adonai bless his people with peace. If Joshua and Caleb taught us that it is not naive to believe in miracles, even in the face of giants, if Theodore Herzl taught us that it is not naive to believe in ourselves, even when giant empires are aligned against us, let us today extrapolate from their teachings. It is not naive to believe in peace, even when a giant is sending missiles our way. So my parents are in their 80s now, and since my father's retirement almost 15 years ago, they've been spending 3 to 4 months every year in Israel, in the late fall and early winter. They had planned to fly out there mid-October 2023 for their annual visit. The events of October 7th did not convince them to cancel their trip. But my cousin, their nephew, who made Aliyah about 30 years ago, he managed to convince them to cancel their trip by telling them you'd be a burden if you came right now. It was October 2023. And then a year went by. Their health declined a bit. They lost confidence. They weren't sure if they could be on their own in Jerusalem anymore. And so you may remember in February, I took a mini sabbatical with my daughter in Jerusalem. I invited my parents to join us. They had such a good time, their belief in themselves was restored. They don't feel confident driving in Israel anymore. They learned for the first time since their own childhood how to use the trains and buses. They found their network of friends and family as robust as ever. And when we learned that we had 3 family weddings this summer, my parents decided they were going. So they are in Jerusalem right now, in a beautiful rental apartment. The public bomb shelter is right next door, and it's serving right now as an ad hoc local synagogue where my father's been joining services at least once a day. When the air raid sirens go off in the middle of the night, sometimes they rouse themselves and make it down to the shelter. My sister is unhappy about this and working on them to take the sirens more seriously. As of this moment, there are no flights out of Israel, at least as of Friday. So my parents are trapped there, whether they like it or not. But all 3 of us, my sister, my brother, and I agree, when flights do resume, we are not going to pressure them to take one. If they decide they need to leave, we will do everything we can to claim 2 seats on one of those planes. But if they decide they want to stay, we will support them in that decision, because it is never naive to believe in yourself or to believe in your people. Shabbat Shalom. Let's turn now to Musaf. Page 184.